Okay. I would like to thank you all for coming on this cold, rainy day to our latest library lecture series. I am Lynn Sutton. I am Dean of the Z. Smith Reynolds Library, and I'd like to welcome you to the library. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel of 4 women scientists. I am proud to call these women my friends and colleagues, and I think they're the very best that Wake Forest has to offer in the way of teacher scholars. We are here to talk about women in science, and each panelist has been asked to talk for about 10 minutes on pretty much whenever they want. Their own careers, their own research interests, what they see as the future for women in science, perhaps some of the past accomplishments of women in science, basically whatever they would like to talk about. We will have each speaker talk for, as I said, about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period at the end. I will introduce all 4, and they can follow one another. The first speaker is Dr. Rebecca Alexander. She is Associate Professor of Chemistry. She received her Bachelor of Science from the University of Delaware and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania with postdoc work at MIT and the Scripps Research Institute. Her research program is primarily centered on understanding the mechanisms of protein synthesis. Next speaker is Dr. Natalie Holtzworth, Professor of Physics. She received her Bachelor of Science from MIT and PhD from the University of Chicago. Her research group is devoted to the development and use of computational tools to model the fundamental and technological properties of materials. Third speaker is Dr. Gloria Moudet, who is Professor of Biology. She received her Bachelor of Science from Virginia Tech, PhD from Purdue, and postdoctoral research at Sandoz Agro. Does that sound? Her emphasis in research is the understanding of hormone signaling and action in 2 different systems with current research projects in auxin transport and leptin signaling. I hope I'm getting these words vaguely right. Sound like I know what I'm talking about. And finally, our 4th speaker is Dr. Jacqueline Fetro, whom, as you know, is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and also Reynolds Professor of Computational Biophysics in Department of Physics and Computer Science. Jackie received her Bachelor of Science from Albright College and her PhD from Penn State with postdoctoral work at the University of Rochester Medical School and the Whitehead Institute for Biomedical Research at MIT. Her research interests are computational biophysics, protein structure and function relationships, computational systems biology, and biological network modeling. So we have a lot of expertise here in this panel, and I'm looking forward to it as much as you. So our first speaker.
So again, thanks all of you for coming on this kind of drizzly, chilly day. So we haven't worked out what we're all going to say. So we may kind of evolve our story as we go, but I'm going to hit on a couple of different topics. First, my understanding of one of the assignments was the contribution of women in science. So discuss the contribution of women in science. So I'll do a little bit of that. So some examples where women were perhaps not well treated. And one kind of shining example of a woman who just kind of plowed through and did her own thing and contributed significantly. And then some current stars and Nobel Prize winners. And then I'm going to talk for a few minutes about kind of how I got to where I am, and so kind of my personal story as a woman in science. And there are no visible clocks. And when I teach a lecture, the students just get up and go. I'm assuming you're not going to get up and go after 10 minutes, so I better have a watch. So women have always contributed to science in one way or another. So I taught last spring for the first time a first-year seminar on the history of women in science. And I learned, probably more than the students, but I learned a lot about the history of women in science. One vignette that I just want to talk about is the Harvard Observatory in the 1880s. And so astronomy and the ability to map where celestial beings were was kind of a newly emerging field. And Edward Pickering was the director of the Harvard Observatory. It took a lot of computational power, mental computational power, to figure out or compute where different celestial beings were orbiting, what their trajectory was, and he needed lots of help. And he said, you know, the men here are not really that organized. My housekeeper could do a better job at this than the men here. And besides, women were going to be paid half as much as the men, and so he could hire twice as many women. And so basically all the staff positions in the Harvard Observatory during that period of time were women who were the computers or the calculators of the astronomical data. So they made half the pay, so he could hire twice as many, and they were called Pickering's harem. There's I'm not sure how they felt about that. There's no reports that I've read about how they felt about being called a harem, but that was pretty much the way it was. He was the boss, they were the underlings, and we talked in class about current examples of that, or not so distant past examples of that. So for a while, most nurses were women, most doctors were men. We talked about elementary schools where the principal is a man and the teachers are women, and so that's not a model that's disappeared entirely. So that's one vignette from the more distant past. Actually about the same time, so not that much more recently, is somebody who, if I'd known about her, might have been a role model for me, but I'd never heard about her until last year when I taught this course. And so how many of you have taken home economics in middle school or high school? So our generation perhaps took home economics and then they gave up. So home economics can be attributed to a woman chemist by the name of Ellen Swallow Richards, who was the first female student admitted at MIT, and she got a degree there in 1873 in chemistry. So she had done some work at Vassar College, which at the time was a women's college. She was very interested in chemistry and basically petitioned to be a student at MIT. She never paid tuition at MIT, and she attributed that to financial aid. Turns out she wasn't officially on the books, so that they couldn't say that there was a woman student there. Okay, so that in case anybody raised a fuss, she's not really a student here. But she did actually get a degree in 1873. She was very interested in water quality, and so after she graduated, she was interested in both water quality on the scientific side and on educating women. So after she graduated, she took on the role of teaching women scientists, women chemistry majors at MIT. She donated her time, and she donated $1,000 a year of her own money in order to set up this lab. So not only did she not get paid, she paid for the privilege of teaching female students. Her research was in water quality, and so the state of Massachusetts hired her to do a thorough investigation of kind of the mineral content of the waters in Massachusetts and the water quality, and that was her interest for a very long time. But she then started to think about, well, how can we apply scientific methodologies to the work that women do in the home? And so she really founded the science, and at the time it was much more of a science, of home economics. And from that, I think some of the work that we as biochemists do in terms of vitamins, what's the vitamin content of certain foods? Does the vitamin content decrease if you boil vegetables? If you freeze vegetables, if you freeze and thaw, if you can them? So that was really the scientific beginnings of home economics and nutritional biochemistry that I would say she was a pioneer in. She was not, however, a trailblazer in terms of making a big fuss about women in science. So not only did she not take pay, but she never got a PhD, even though she certainly would have done enough work for a PhD if she'd been a man. So MIT refused at the time to grant her a PhD. Vassar granted her a master's based on the work she had done at MIT, but she, to my understanding, never got a PhD. So now we're going to jump ahead a lot of years and talk about the 2009 Nobel Prizes. And I know Dean Fetcher is going to talk about those, so I won't steal too much of her thunder. But I will just mention that 4 female scientists received Nobel Prizes in 2009, and that was more. So that increased the total number of Nobel Prizes in science awarded to women by 13%. So in a single year, it jumped 13% because of those 4 awards. And so in particular, so I've heard at least 2 of them speak. The economics Nobel Prize winner, I probably wouldn't have had an opportunity to speak, but 3 of them were basically in my area of biochemistry, biophysics, structural biology. And so, in fact, one of them came to speak at a conference I organized 2 weeks after she was awarded, I mean, not after she got the Nobel Prize, but after it was announced. We weren't sure until the day before she was to come whether she was still going to come, but she came and was very gracious with her time and gave a great talk. But one of the great things about last year's Nobel Prizes is not only did 4 women receive the Nobel Prizes, but 2 of them were a PhD advisor graduate student pair. So this was work done on telomerase, the enzyme that repairs the ends of your genes. And so Carol Greider was a PhD student in the lab of Elizabeth Blackburn when the work was done. So there was a female mentor-student pair, and so that's really exciting. So I'll let Dean Fetra talk more about. So unlike Carol Greider, I didn't have a female PhD advisor, and in fact, I would say I've never in my education had a female mentor role model in an academic advisor kind of setting. But there are several factors that I'm going to talk about just for a couple of minutes on that I think have helped me to kind of stay on track, stay in the pipeline to get to this point. Being a scientist, being a science professor at Wake is, even on the best days, the best job I could have. I'm sorry, even on the worst days. Today's not a worst day, but there are bad days. But even when lab work isn't going well or the grant gets rejected, I'm still glad to be here, still glad to have this job. So a couple of things that I think contributed or can contribute to women scientists. So first of all, my father was a scientist, is a scientist, he's a physicist. And as my class and I studied many great role models of women scientists through history, we made note and kind of counted up how many of the successful women had fathers who were scientists. And the number is actually not trivial. The percentage is not trivial. Or if they didn't have a father who was a scientist, they had a father who encouraged their scientific interests, or if not a father, an uncle or a grandfather or a brother. Okay, so there were many examples of women who were encouraged to do something that was maybe hard or that maybe society didn't value because their father or their brother or their uncle said, yes, you should do it. You're good at this and keep pursuing it, and it doesn't matter what they say, or I'll pay for your education. That's also a big one. I have had, so I've had male PhD advisor, male postdoctoral advisor, male undergraduate research advisor who are all very supportive. And that made a big difference. So even though I wouldn't say I had any female role models per se, I certainly had female professors that I stopped afterwards and said, so how does this work? I remember my biochemistry professor in college, as I was graduating, was already engaged, wanted to have a family, said, I know you have kids, how does this work? Is it going to work? So she sat me down and we talked for a while. She didn't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers when my students ask that, but it's good to be available to at least try to answer those questions. So that's one tick in my favor, perhaps. My mother is a physician and a biologist, and so we were always dissecting things at home. My dad was always borrowing a telescope to look at stars in the backyard, and so it's kind of unavoidable that would be a good career option. My mother was actually one of only 3 women in her med school class in the late 1950s, and so she certainly wasn't significantly discriminated against, but she certainly knew also that she was not in the majority. And always encouraged us, so I'm the oldest of 3 girls, always encouraged us to reach for the highest thing that we thought we were good at and wanted to do. And this may sound somewhat elitist, and so I hope it doesn't offend anyone, but I had a very good friend in middle school who at the time wanted to be a dental hygienist. And that was a great aspiration for a middle school girl, and my mom said, okay, but why not go try to be a dentist? It's okay to be a dental hygienist if you want to be a dental hygienist, but if you think you might want to be a dentist, go that route. And it turns out she's not a dentist or a dental hygienist, but she's a tenured professor of material science at our alma mater. And so she's a scientist working very hard and doing very well. So those are 2 things in the right ticks in the positive column. Also, I found the right place for me to be a scientist. Wake Forest is the right place for me. It has been for 10 years, and I hope it will be for a long time, because I can do science. So today I was running up and down between the radioactive lab and my office, carrying radioactivity around the department. It's a new experience, but also meeting with my students about their careers. And so this is a great place to be a scientist, be a mentor, be a teacher scholar. And lastly, this is a great place and this is a great job because I'm surrounded by great women, some of whom are here and in the audience, and who are great co-mentors. And we encourage one another. We take each other out for lunch. We say, how are you doing? How can I help? What do you need to talk about? And so I think that's a great role that we all play. And so in some sense, perhaps we've reached a critical mass of women in science so that we're not the only one, the trailblazer, trying to make it work. And I'm clearly out of time, so I will pass the podium Mr. Holzer.
So I'm actually on leave, and so I'm a little bit out of practice of giving a talk. So I made a little PowerPoint presentation. There was a recent article in New York Times discussing this very issue of women in science, and so I took some of that information and made a part of the presentation I thought would be good to share with you. I don't know if you can see that. This was a report, the article was based largely on a report by the AAUP, which is entitled "Why So Few?", implying that there are very few women in science. And in my mind and in my career, it isn't that few. And if you look over the years, this goes from 1960 to 2000, there is an upward trend of the numbers of women participating in science. These are women in science and engineering occupations. The top one is biology, and they're about a third, or no, nearly a half of the people they counted are women. It's a little less than half. The next is chemistry and mathematics. Great is, yes, mathematics and computer science. And physics and engineering is a little bit lagging. So it isn't quite so dire. The numbers are going up. And hopefully that trend will continue. If you look at the faculty members among four-year colleges, the blue indicates the non-tenured faculty, and the brown is the tenured faculty. The biological sciences has 42% women for non-tenured and 23% for tenure track. And on the top is the engineering, which again is 7% for the tenured and 17% for the non-tenured or untenured. So again, this was in 2006. So again, it isn't a minuscule number. It is, but it is a little bit smaller. It isn't 50-50. And then you might ask the question, what about majors, choice of majors? And this is a graph that shows the choice of majors. The men are on the right and the women are on the left. And as far as choice of majors, the yellow is biological sciences. So there, in fact, according to this study, and this was in 2007, there are actually more women who majored as undergraduates in biological sciences than men. And the top ones are the engineering and physics sectors, which those are much smaller. The overall number of science majors at the college level of women in these areas is smaller, but the distribution is interesting. For example, in mathematics and computer science, it's about equal. And again, this is, I think, the last graph I'm going to show you from the study. This is over the years going from 1966 to 2006, the number of women, the percentage of women in the various areas. The purple one is the most recent one, and the black one, the earliest one, is again going up. So more women are going into these fields. So in my mind, I always thought that the people who came before me were the trailblazers, the people who made it possible for women to go into science. And I hate to tell you my age, but in 1964, when I was going to college, I was very happy to be admitted to MIT, and the reason that I could go was due to an alumna, Catherine Graham McCormick, who I think she spent actually 1 year at MIT, and she was very instrumental in a lot of biological studies. She was very successful as a scientist, but and she was very fortunate to have married a very wealthy man. Her life, it seems, was very unhappy. Her husband, McCormick, developed a very serious illness 2 years after they married, and he spent many years in an institution. But nevertheless, she had a positive experience when she went to MIT, and she felt very kindly to MIT, and she decided one thing that she could help with was to build a dormitory for women. Before this dormitory was built, the women who came didn't really have a place to stay, and as Rebecca was saying, often they had very strange arrangements. It wasn't that they were excluded, but there was no place. There was no accommodations for them. And so Catherine McCormick built this dormitory, and we were the second class that had 50 students out of a class of 1,000. And so we felt quite at home in a predominantly male institution. And I must confess, most people do enjoy their undergraduate years, but I really did enjoy it. Didn't mind being one of a few women. And some of our alumni are very famous, and I'm very proud to mention one of my most famous classmates is Shirley Jackson. I remember sitting in physics class with her, and we were discussing how to do our homework together. And now she's president of Rensselaer Polytech, so she did something right. So just a few personal comments. After going to undergraduate school, I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, and I didn't find any roadblocks there. Particularly, I mean, the faculty there were in general supportive. You could always find someone who is not considerate and so on. And you always ask yourself, is it because I'm a woman or because he was having a bad day? You know, you never know about those things. But I think what was really helpful to my career was Jack Williams in the physics department at Wake Forest. Having a husband that's also in a career, in this case physics as well, is very hard to find two jobs in one place, and it's a problem, a serious problem for all involved. And he worked very hard to find a solution at Wake Forest that he could hire two faculty at the same time, and I've been always very grateful to him and the department for accommodating us in that way. And I think that's, so in fact, so why should women go into science? In fact, I think there's no question that all people who are talented should go into the field that they enjoy and they're good at. And it's not gender specific or ethnic specific. And it would be a shame if social issues got in the way of good work. And what I find most disturbing is that science in general is not as popular as I'd like it to be, whether it's females or males or different ethnic groups. I don't know the answer to that, but hopefully somebody does, and we'll get a better, more progress in all of these areas. So I guess that's basically all I had to say.
So I want to start by saying this is sort of strange for me. I've never stood up in front of a bunch of people and talked about being a woman in science before. So I've talked about science, and I've been a woman, but I've never talked about this on purpose. So it's sort of hard to know what to say. I mean, I think the thing that I most want to say is that for me, it's not really been particularly relevant most of the time that I was a woman. I just was a scientist. I did what I wanted to. I enjoyed science, and it was the career path that made sense for me. And so I think, looking at the numbers, not that I could actually see them from where I was sitting, but maybe the numbers speak to, if you're interested in biology, you're not an outlier if you're a woman. In fact, I checked the numbers in our department to see where we stand. And since the early 90s, we've had actually more women than male majors in biology, so it's ranged from 55 to 60% since the early 90s. So things aren't different there, and I guess that's why when I look around my classroom, in fact, a couple of us were talking, the total pool of majors is a little more women, but I don't teach any ecology courses, and we think that there are actually more guys in the ecology and more women in the cell and molecular courses, and so in fact I probably have a much greater majority of women than that in many of my classes. So it's sort of nice to not really even notice or be aware of the fact. It also was easy because there were several strong women in the department when I came to it who were great mentors, Carol Brown and Nina Allen, who's no longer at Wake, who moved to NC State. And so that's a nice thing to not have to really be aware of it. I wanted to follow up on one point, which is, I guess for students, the thing that I'm and I also looked at the examples for the med students. So those students who apply to medical school, because we have really good numbers from Dr. Lane on that, and actually the numbers over the last 10 years, there have been 329 females and 330 males that have applied to med school from Wake Forest. So those numbers couldn't be better matched. And the percentage for acceptance is greater than 70% for both females and males. So, so it's clear that there are a lot of women going to med school majoring in biology. I guess the thing that's always interesting to think about is, though, whether women or all students are thinking about some of these other careers in science. So somebody alluded to that. There's so many great things to do besides go to medical school. And so I'm sorry that such a large percent of our students have that in mind when they get here and they never explore other options. And so it's, I think, demanding jobs, whether you go into academics or medicine, but it's sort of nice to be able to, when your kids are sick, go home and type on the computer at home. It's a little hard to do that when you're a physician, right? You can't do patients by the internet very well. So it's a nice combination when you have family responsibilities to have flexible jobs and jobs that are fun. I guess the other thing I was thinking about when Rebecca was talking about our role models. So I actually had no professors in undergrad or grad school that were women in the sciences at all that I can recall. It is interesting. I was at very conservative Virginia Tech and Purdue on the last fronts of women coming into academics. But it's interesting because I was raised by my mother, who has a master's degree in home economics from UNCG back when it was women's college. And actually her degree was her focus was textiles, which is now in the engineering school at NC State. And so I guess it does tell you that I can't make an exception to your rule, although it was interesting to have a mother rather than a father in that capacity. So I guess the final thing that I just wanted to reflect on was how nice it is to be at a place where it's never really, I felt, to be an issue to be a woman. And there were a couple women, they were mentors, but I'd say the strongest mentors that I've had both at Wake Forest and before getting here were all men. And so I guess, to me, the key thing to succeeding as a woman in science, or anybody in science, is good, strong mentors, and how important it is to be mentored and to mentor whenever possible, to help people discover what they like, the challenges, but really develop their passions for whatever academics. And so it's nice that men and women are equally good at mentoring around here, and so that's a great thing. And then finally, it's also nice to be in a place where, so I've compared notes with people. I'll never forget the large Big Ten university that I visited. And I was actually pregnant at the time with my first child, and we went out to eat, and there was one other woman and two other men, and they wondered why I didn't want any wine or sushi, and I finally had to explain I was pregnant. I wasn't very pregnant. So one of the men turned and said, "Oh yeah, Mary here is proof that this is a great place, that it's easy to have children and to be an academic." And Mary turned around and said, "Well, actually, they told me I couldn't have a baby after I had tenure." And it was really quite a tense moment to be in a place where, there was this antagonism between the choices of science and family. And I think it's great that we're in a place where there isn't that kind of antagonism, and hopefully that kind of place will fade with time, because clearly in today's world, thankfully, sharing the roles for responsibilities for family is much more uniform. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
So I guess I'm going to close this out today. So one of the things that we all were asked to speak about is a little bit about our history in science. And both Rebecca and Gloria mentioned the idea of having someone in your family who was a scientist. I didn't have that. No mother, no father, no sister, no cousin, no uncle. Somehow I just always knew I wanted to be a scientist. I didn't know what kind. I always enjoyed trying to figure out how things worked. I was not dissuaded by people who might have tried to dissuade me, like my high school principal, who said that I didn't need to take physics. He actually said there were 4 of us in my senior class who wanted to take second-year physics. And we went to him. He decided not to offer the class. And we went to him and asked, "Why aren't you going to offer this class in physics too? There are 4 of us who wanted to take it." And he looked at the 3 guys, and he said, "I can't offer a class for just three people." And he looked at me, and he said, "And you don't need physics." So I was not dissuaded by that. I went through and I did the normal thing, as Lynn already mentioned. And I really, like Gloria, found that being female was just not particularly relevant. I just did what everybody else did, and I walked through the career path, and have really actually, I think, found a home here at Wake Forest for being both a teacher and a scholar. Rebecca, in her presentation, mentioned a few vignettes about women in science, the history of women in science, and how they have paved the way for us. She mentioned Pickering's harem, which is an interesting story, and the chemistry major at MIT who founded the field of home economics. I want to pick up on that and offer a different vignette. I had a friend when I was in Albany who was a biology professor at Siena College, and she was very interested in women in science. And she went and she actually did a large amount of research, and she found, well, one of the things that we know, and Rebecca has already alluded to it, that research universities were seldom willing to offer women their own academic positions. The women didn't have a lab of their own in the late 1800s or early 1900s. So how do the women who want to do science, how do they have that career? Well, it turns out women could volunteer. They could work on a volunteer basis in museums. They could do professional quality research, and maybe eventually be given a title, but they were never truly respected in their field. And what Pat found, in fact, was that a lot of early women who were successful, actually were successful because they married a scientist, and they were able to work in their husband's laboratory. They didn't have their own position. They didn't have their own title. But she found that particularly in her field of biology, that success was really, for the women, was that having the capability of working in their husband's lab. But the counterpart to that was a lot of these men went on to win awards.
And she thought that the success of the biologist husband may have risen, at least in part, from the scientific acumen and the accomplishments of the wife, who they had basically working for free in their laboratories. I would agree. I would agree with what Natalie said, that these women who came before us were really trailblazers for us. They didn't have positions, they didn't have titles, but they did some great work. Rebecca alluded to this year having 4 Nobel Prize winners who were women. Let's take a brief look at the history of the Nobel Prizes to see what an accomplishment this really was. For the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, of 195 individuals awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, only 10 have been women. And one of them, Gertie Corey, shared the award with her husband. She's a person who worked in her husband's laboratory. Of 156 individuals awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, only 4 have been women. One of those 4, Irene Curie, shared the prize with her husband. And of the 186 individuals awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, only 2 were women. One of those, Marie Curie, shared the Nobel Prize with her for her work in her husband's laboratory. So we've come a really, really long way. In 2009, the Nobel Prize, as Rebecca mentioned, in Physiology and Medicine was awarded to 1 man and to 2 women for their work on telomerase. And I think that's a great achievement. And that we can thank these women who came before us as trailblazers. But I would like to say that we're not done. We can think we've come a long way, and we really, really have, but we are truly not done. When I worked at another institution, I had a colleague in the chemistry department call me up one day, and he asked if he could bring his 5th grade daughter over to get a tour of my laboratory. And I said, sure. And she came in with her dad, and we gave her a tour of the lab, and I introduced her to the grad students and the postdocs and the research techs who were working there. And some of those people who were working in my lab were female and some were male. And at one point, the father stopped the tour, and he said to his daughter, look at this. He said, look who's the boss, and look who's working for her. And later on, I asked him why he said that, and he told me that his daughter was being told in school by her classmates that she A, couldn't be a scientist, but B, she couldn't be a boss because she was a woman. And that was just not that long ago. So I think we need to take the message of Madeleine Albright to heart. And Madeleine Albright has said, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women. I think we really want to think about how we are mentoring and to continue to take, I think all of us have mentioned the mentors we've had, both male and female, who've been really important in our own careers, helping women to find and develop their own passions in whatever field they choose. And I would challenge all of us to take that message to heart, to take time to mentor and encourage other women, because if women are still receiving, if young girls are still receiving that message that the daughter of my former colleague received, they need to hear a different message from those of us who are successful, and they need to hear that message really loudly and really clearly. And with that, I would like to thank Lynn and the library staff for hosting this great symposium, and I think I'll turn the floor back to Lynn.
We have 10 or 15 minutes for questions, so I hope you all have been saving them up. Who has a question?
I'd like to know how many of you have children, and how you, if you do have children, I think you spoke to definitely having children, kind of worked around, and if that made you detour off of your career path at all.
I think 3 of us have kids.
Yes.
I'm the only one who hasn't had kids in this group, so you want to speak to these guys.
Mine are probably the youngest, so I'm probably the one who deals with it routinely more and more. Sorry, I'll stand up. So I could just talk about today as an example. But my kids don't have school today, and I still want to be at work. So something I didn't talk about in kind of things that have helped me along the way, and I'm glad he's not here, is my husband. So Gloria and I definitely both would attribute a lot of help to our husbands. Gloria's husband has stayed home with their kids. My husband left a very promising career as a mechanical engineer and MBA in the power industry to follow me around the country as I did a postdoc on 2 different coasts and as I took a job here. So he's been, there's no way I could do what I do and have a family without him, which is kind of silly to say. But he makes it work day to day, and he's made huge sacrifices for his career, for me to be where I am. So his job is a little bit more flexible than mine even. He works very close to home and shuttles kids around most of the time, much more than I do. Stayed home, so my first year at Wake, he stayed home with our 9-month-old, and so kind of in her first year, he was home with her. Since then, it's taken a village. Both sets of grandparents live in the area, and so today at lunchtime, I shuttled kids from one set of grandparents to the other set of grandparents because they don't have school. And so it's taken a lot of thoughtfulness. Also, I decided, it was not always easy to stick to, that if I couldn't have a reasonably balanced family life and get tenure, that I didn't want tenure. There's some days I had to remind myself of that loud and clear, that I was not going to sacrifice my family to get tenure. And that's always been hard. And Gloria can talk about balanced guilt if she wants.
Well, so you also asked about timelines. So, I think it is the case that if people figure out where to work kids into this scheme in different ways. So in biology, there are several of us who waited till after we had, so there was one of us, so all the women in biology have children, and one of them had kids when they were grad student, one had them when they were postdocs. Some of us had them after we got here, before and after tenure. So there's a whole mix. I think it's probably hardest when you're still in grad school to get a thesis done. So it's a little easier to wait. But it was great. I mean, I remember on my job interview hearing from somebody about their kids and how they worked them in, and it became clear that you could do it, and it would work. It's hard, and having somebody who helps at home is an essential. And so thankfully, that's a lot more common these days.
Well, I also had kids, but they're all grown up now. I mean, it is a very short period of your life where your kids are small, and it's a very lovely period of life, but they
At least
grow
in
up.
retrospect, right?
But my husband also made a sacrifice, came here. Well, I don't know if it's a sacrifice or not, but he did change jobs to come here. And so one of my mentors, Millie Dresselhaus, said, "You have to marry the right person." And I guess that's always true. I don't think it's particularly harder for women in science than it is any academic to have women. I have children. So, we certainly benefited from having good help. But I hope one day Wake Forest will have a daycare center. They keep on talking about it.
Yes.
I was going to ask that very question. Can you suggest other ways an institution like Wake Forest could help all the members bring up children? The daycare center would certainly be one.
Yes, it should.
Well, I can think of a couple. One would be the daycare center, or some way to access good daycare for our faculty. I think a second is paying attention to two-career couples and trying to make opportunities for both members of two-career couples, and facilitating them to have. I mean, imagine trying to have two careers in a family and living hundreds of miles apart, and people in academics do that, and that's unfortunate. And there was a third one in my head, and I forgot what it was. You guys have any thoughts?
The parental leave policy.
The parental leave policy, which we finally have. Right. So having the appropriate, that's exactly right. That's exactly the right one. Having the appropriate leave policies that allow parents to have a period of time off after the birth of their children, and make sure that nothing changes, that we have good policies, and we finally do. So we're trying to make some progress on that.
One thing that I see here is a lot of you said interview with look at the gender thing so much, do you think that women in general are gravitating to that mindset now, rather than being stuck in, oh, I'm in a profession that is all men, you know, or do you think that we are getting beyond gender?
That's a great question. I think we are and we aren't. I think that you guys chime in here, but I think the women who came before us have been trailblazers. So I think it's easier for those of us now, but I don't think the barriers are completely removed either. So I definitely think we still have space and we still have things that we need to do, because the barriers are still, some barriers are still there. They're just less than they used to be. I mean, even in our own professional societies, I took a look at one of my professional societies before I gave this talk to see what kinds of awards and honors they had given, and their numbers for women are abysmally low, and they have 2 awards that have been co-awarded to a husband and wife even in recent days. So we're not done, but it's better than it used to be.
Well, yeah, and it's so hard. You wonder about things and you don't know. You go to a meeting and you all of a sudden look at the list and you see how few women are speaking at the meeting. What is that about? Aren't there people who could be talking? But then you go to organize a meeting and you have struggled trying to find people who are on the topic you want. So, you can look at the glass half full and half empty, and it's really hard to know. As Natalie said, if somebody makes it hard, is it because they're having a bad day or because you're a woman? You never really know. And I think it's just easier to, you can't do anything about it, so why, focus on that being the source of the problem? Find another way to get around the problem, because that's not likely going to be the thing you change.
I was wondering, has anybody made a comparison between the United States and the other countries, in Asia, for example, and Europe? Are you worse off, better off?
Good question.
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer.
No idea.
No idea.
No?
Anybody in the audience know?
Because I remember
I
that when
think
I
they
went to...
came up with some studies in issues 2 or 3 years ago of the science field and women in the sciences around the world, because the AUP doesn't just look at the national issues, but also international issues. And they were saying, how far behind we are in the science and it's attracting women, because in other countries, women do go. I have 5 nieces that are engineers in Chile.
Well, it was interesting. I talked to somebody who was from Sweden about the maternity policy, and you have a year or 2.
Yes.
It was mind-boggling the amount of time you had, and nobody had any expectations for
A
you.
year and full pay.
Yeah. So.
And my colleagues in France, if they're, so my colleagues who are chemists and biochemists in France, there is an assumption that they will take half of a day off a week to be with their kids. So that they're essentially working at 80%, 90%, so full pay, but 90% work effort, because the kids are off on Wednesday afternoons, and so all the moms disappear Wednesday afternoons, and that's not, nobody's saying, they're not here, it's just a way of life. And so I think there's greater flexibility with that, and assumption that families are important.
How do you explain that? Because Americans are afraid of socialism?
That would be my guess.
Those places have lower birth rates to start with, so they have to have policies in place to get the birth rates up, whereas we have a high birth rate, high immigration rate, so there's less interest in keep them.
Excellent point, Carol.
Also,
another.
Kira lived in France, it would say that Americans live to work and the French work to live.
Molly?
I know there's the perception with high school students that when they apply to college, they're applying to a college that is going to offer the strongest program in a field they're already thinking about going into. And so if we're thinking about trying to get more students into science, and particularly women into science, what outreach opportunities do y'all see for talking to high school students and even looking at middle school students? Because oftentimes, by the time you're in high school, with IB and AP, you are specializing even at that point. What programs could be offered? Where could Wake Forest go with this? If we don't have something specific already, how can we reach the next generation to get them excited?
I think we're already doing some of that. Rebecca's first year seminar,
Career Award?
Sure. So many of us do outreach in the community, science, English, reading, and so we actually have lots of opportunities for contact with students and their teachers. So I have an NSF, National Science Foundation research grant, but part of that, both time and money and effort, goes towards me teaching a workshop for science teachers, public school science teachers, for 2 weeks every summer. So I bring in 15 science teachers. They're on Wake's campus for 2 weeks. We do hands-on lab stuff, and then some of us also go to the public schools. So even our chemistry club, and I know the biology students do similar things, we take demos to the classrooms. Duke has a talent identification program for 6th graders, I believe. They've come to Wake's campus and toured the labs. We do lab tours in the chemistry building not every month, but several times a year. So bringing in public school students and their teachers to show them the opportunities. We're well represented by women who do those tours, and so that helps. And so then my first year seminar on women in science last spring followed up on what Ann Boyle had done with an after-school reading club, and we did after-school science clubs. So we took the Wake students, first-year Wake students who are learning about the hurdles for women in science, and we actually split up these 8th graders into girls' science clubs and boys' science clubs. The boys worked with the boys, the girls students worked with the girls to try to make it a safe atmosphere. They got to do some cool science. Of course, we take the coolest stuff, and so that's a lot of fun. So I think a lot of us are doing things. We're always looking for different opportunities, ways to make it more beneficial and expand it.
Sarah.
So I'm curious, what kind of advice would you offer to like freshmen or sophomores who are considering majoring in science and want to get their PhDs in science?
Work in a lab, and then work in another lab, and then work some more in a lab. I mean, it's the best way to learn to do science, but you also make contacts, you have opportunities to get mentored and find out how it really works. I mean, it's shocking to me how little students understand about applying to grad school and how it works, and how you should contact people. It's not just like applying to a med school where it's all about your numbers. It's about making connection, finding somebody who's going to do work in an area you want, and make those connections so that there's a good fit, and really find out how much, what it's like to work in a lab, because it's not about books, it's really about the practice of doing it.
And I would add to that, because that's exactly what I would have said, but stick with the research stick with working in the lab long enough to actually accomplish a project where you can say, this is mine, take that and put it on a poster, take it to a conference, meet people in the field, but work there, not just a semester, but long enough to be able to say that I worked on this project and I worked on it long enough to understand it. Because that's what the graduate schools really care about. They're going to ask you, what did you do for your research project? And if you can articulate that, that's really important.
I would just like to ask a question of the students in the audience, if you're willing. How do you feel about being in science? Do you feel supported? Do you feel that there are significant barriers? Are you here because you think you could use additional support? Anybody willing?
I have felt no barriers at Wake Forest. I mean, I don't really think about the fact that I'm a woman in science when doing homework. I mean, either I'm going to get the differential equation or I'm not.
Okay.
I
So maybe we're getting a little further. Elise.
I have one question. Y'all mentioned, for instance, for the medical school, that roughly equal numbers of men and women apply. Do we have any idea if roughly equal numbers of men and women are graduating from medical school or from biology programs and such?
I think the roughly equal applications and acceptances to medical school were Wake Forest numbers. I do not think those are nationwide numbers. And I don't know if Hugo follows our students, our graduates, to see if they graduate from med school.
He didn't seem to have additional data on that. But I mean, isn't the rate of graduation from med school is pretty good?
Pretty good.
Yeah, I think so. So I think it's.
One last question, anyone?
Just have to add a small comment. The best students have ever taught in music were physicists or chemists. They were both, the science of music and the science goes hand in hand. They be the most talented, the ones that have done the work, the ones that know how to practice and get the job done. So I really enjoy having students from the sciences.
Right, well, I believe we have some refreshments in the back, so maybe you can stay and talk with our speakers. And I'd like to thank everyone once again.